to a trial that has electrified America, one that illustrates how race politics is destroying justice and truth, not to mention the media, its culpability here. Let me tell you a story, the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, who was 17 years old when he was charged with driving over a state border, illegally armed with an assault rifle, and then murdering 2 men during another Black Lives Matter riot last year. And much of the media ran with that story, painting Rittenhouse as some sort of white nationalist vigilante looking for trouble, a racist. Joe Biden, now the president, labelled Rittenhouse a white nationalist, saying he was protected by Donald Trump. An activist warned that if he wasn't convicted, protesters should burn down the town where he was arrested, and only a racist would want him found innocent. But now we've had the trial, heard the evidence. The jury is out considering its verdict. And the evidence shows to me and to many others that in fact Rittenhouse was framed. He was scapegoated. And the prosecutor's decision to charge him with all those crimes, murder and the rest, was deeply unfair, seems deeply political. Let me set the scene from what we have now heard. This particular riot started when police in a town in Wisconsin, a town called Kenosha, were called to a domestic incident and tried to taser the alleged offender, Jacob Blake. Blake didn't stop, went to his car, lunged for a knife. Police shot him and crippled him. The media beat up the race angle. Riots started straight away, and parts of the city were torched and looted. And people who tried to save their business, like an elderly man with a fire extinguisher, they were bashed senseless by the mob. Rittenhouse lived 30 kilometres away in the state of Illinois, but his dad and his and many of his other family members, they lived in Kenosha, and he drove there to help clean graffiti from a school. And then he says someone asked him to defend a car yard from the rioters. Now, Rittenhouse had a semi-automatic rifle that he kept in the house of a friend's granddad in Kenosha. He didn't bring it from interstate at all. And on the fateful night of the shooting, he was interviewed in the street.
What are you doing out here? Obviously you're armed and you're in front of this business we saw burning last night, so what's up?
So people are getting injured and our job is to protect this business, and part of my job is to also help people. If there's somebody hurt, I'm running into harm's way. That's why I have my rifle, because I need to protect myself, obviously, but I also have my med kit.
But it all went horribly wrong. First, he says he was threatened by a protester, Joseph Rosenbaum, who later turned out to be a convicted child abuser just let out of a mental asylum. Rittenhouse said Rosenbaum, who was carrying a chain, threatened repeatedly to kill him, tear out his heart, and then chased Rittenhouse down the street, throwing something. Rittenhouse says he heard a shot behind him and turned. He said Rosenbaum went for his gun, and Rittenhouse, frightened, fired and shot him dead.
I was cornered from in front of me with Mr. Zeminski, and there were three people right there.
Rittenhouse then fled that scene and was again chased by the mob. They caught him and he fell to the ground, still with his gun. One man kicked him in the head. Another man belted him with his skateboard and grabbed his gun. Rittenhouse shot him dead. Another man chasing Rittenhouse and also armed with a gun. He first put up his hands after the shooting, but then lowered them and aimed his pistol at Rittenhouse's head, as he admitted in the trial, before Rittenhouse fired and wounded him.
It wasn't until you pointed your gun at him, advanced on him with your gun, now your hands down, pointed at him, that he fired, right?
Correct.
The picture here seems crystal clear. Rittenhouse acted in self-defense. At the worst, he committed manslaughter, not murder. Maybe he should have stayed at home, not had a gun, let the crowds burn down stuff. And note, all three people he shot, who chased him or threatened him, held a gun to his head, and they were all white. Where's the racist angle in this? In fact, there was no evidence at this trial that Rittenhouse was a racist or a white nationalist, a white supremacist, none of it. I was joined a short while ago by Annalise Nielsen, Sky News US correspondent. Can you explain to me how these charges were laid in the first place? Because it stinks to me of politics.
Well, look, the American legal system is very different from the Australian. There is more room for the politicisation of charges because prosecutors are elected here, as are judges, and there is a lot of public pressure on this case. It was very high profile at the time, and it's taken a long time to get into court. There are a range of charges that have been brought against Rittenhouse. A few of them have been dropped, the lesser ones of misdemeanor carrying a weapon and being out after the curfew, but there's still the option of both intentional and then reckless homicide. And that's quite a huge distinction. And that's what the jury has been grappling with, we know, for at least 8 hours of deliberation after they've been sent out by the court, because this is the fundamental question that the jury is considering, but also that Americans have been fascinated by. Is it reasonable for a person with a weapon like that to defend themselves in those circumstances? Now, critics have said he shouldn't be out with an AR-15. We know he legally wasn't allowed to carry a gun of that caliber, and it was bought for him illegally. There could be charges pending there as well for the person who did that for him. But the footage as well was quite compelling about him being chased by multiple people, being struck, and that's really enlivened the pro-gun lobbyists, pro-gun community in the US, because it is quite a strong community.
Well, look, the gun laws are one thing, but once you do have a gun law and you're entitled to have a gun, well, then you're going to get people who are going to protect themselves, particularly in a situation where the law enforcement in Kenosha didn't seem to be protecting those businesses themselves. They seemed overwhelmed or in retreat or whatever it is. What is the situation in Kenosha at the moment? I know you're going there tomorrow. We look forward to your reports from the scene tomorrow when the jury, we hope, will come out with a verdict. How tense is the situation there?
Well, this is one of the things that's going to be interesting to gauge, because it's none of the traditional players that we saw from the riots after George Floyd was murdered. That was a very specific focus among protesters, that there was a heavy presence of BLM and Antifa. In this situation, we're talking about a Caucasian person who is alleged to have murdered 2 Caucasian people, and so you don't know if that's going to hit the same kind of emotive potential that we saw with George Floyd, and then also Jacob Blake as well, who sparked the riots in Kenosha. We do know that the US has already sent out 500 National Guard. That does seem like a bit of a kind of knee-jerk reaction now to anything that has the potential for violence, because there were so many instances last year where people were caught unaware when this stuff started happening. And once you lose momentum in the beginning, it's really hard to get things back under control. So it will be interesting to see if there is any kind of strong response. But I mean, as we've seen from the Rittenhouse case, it only takes a few people to cause some pretty serious damage in a confined space. And so even if there aren't huge throngs of crowds, it doesn't mean that there couldn't be the potential for some serious repercussions.
Joe Biden, before the trial, back when he was in the debates with Donald Trump, called Rittenhouse a white supremacist, made him a sort of emblem of the Trump troubles. What is he saying now? There's been questions asked of his spokesman about whether he regrets those comments. What is he saying now?
Well, look, they're not saying much. His press secretary, Jen Psaki, has said that he's not commenting on a case as it's going to trial. We didn't quite see the same for Derek Chauvin when that was being deliberated. The president was weighing in on that, and that was arguably much more high-profile, intense situation. So it appears he may have learned his lesson after that. There's a potential too for influencing the outcome of a case that's quite serious when you're the president, even with carefully picked words. The fact you say anything at all could have an influence on a jury. And in this instance, the jury isn't being sequestered. They're going home each night. And this has had wall-to-wall coverage on many networks in the US and in newspapers. And so there is a really real risk that these words will influence jurors.
Annalise Nielsen, thank you so much for your time.